Alright, for today's critical thought, this is going to be my spooky Halloween edition. Ooh. As you can see by my very elaborate costume, I went all out for Halloween this year. And for those of you watching this right now, this post or this video should be going up on November 1st. So this will be my belated talk on horror. Ooh. I just blind myself there. But we have talked about horror many times over in these videos. And for today's piece, I want to focus on why good horror design is actually quite difficult to pull off. Now, as we've seen over the last 5-6 years, there have certainly been a number of horror games being released in the indie space. Five Nights at Freddy's, Slender Man, Outlast, and the many spiritual sequels and remakes and homages, we could call them, of those various designs. But, as I've said before, these games just don't do anything for me. And the reasons, as we've said, have to do with how they approach horror. Now, for today's piece, I want to talk about some of the ways that doing horror right are difficult. And the first one is the idea of the AntiPower Fantasy. Now, video games, at least for the majority of games out there, are built on some semblance of a power fantasy. Or some semblance of a fantasy, I should say. You are owning a corporation, you're ruling a planet, you're fighting space aliens, you're falling in love, you name it, there is a fantasy out there for you. And when it comes to horror, horror requires a very specific touch when it comes to the setting. Many horror games, as we've seen, especially again in the indie space, go for the complete antithesis of horror. You have very little, if not any way of defending yourself. In a game like Amnesia, if an enemy spots you, all you can do is run. There are no weapons in the environment, there's nothing you can use to get away from them. They see you, you either have to get out of sight quickly, or you're dead. Same goes for something like Five Nights. While in Five Nights you are interacting with the space, it's still very limited. The second a character gets past whatever you're doing, it's game over. Now the problem with that, as we've talked about before, is that it fails the fight or flight response, as in that psychological response that decides whether you will stand up in a situation or run away. By robbing the player of the fight, it removes the choice and essentially the weight of the decision of playing that game. Not only that, but it also is a really great example of ludonarrative dissonance, wherein I'm in a farm where there's tons of butcher knives and cleavers and scythes, but I can't pick any of them up because the game won't allow me, as in Outlast. Now, the other part about this is that one thing that a lot of these indie games tend to forget is that horror movies, and some of the better ones, do give the the hero or heroine, the means of fighting back. But it's done in a different way. In a power fantasy, when you pick up a new weapon or you get a new power, that's the moment of superiority. That's when you go, oh yeah, it's on. Doom 2016 is a brilliant example of that. The whole setting of Doom is supposed to be very scary. I'm stuck on a planet with literally hell coming out to get me. But no one is feeling scared in Doom. And I'm sure everyone did like a fist pump moment the second the Doom guy picked up his shotgun for the first time and, cocked it right there at the start. That is very awesome. But in a movie such as Evil Dead, as we've talked about, when Ash gets loaded up with his chainsaw and boomstick to go into the cellar in Evil Dead 2, that is not a moment of power fantasy. That is a, oh my god, I'm going to have to go down and fight this thing situation. And you see this in a lot of the best horror movies, where the main character gets into a position where they either have to lure the bad guy or they have to actually deal with them. But again, even though they are given the means of doing so, it's never a moment of them being in control. It's basically forcing them into a situation where they don't want to be. And that's why you need that kind of balance between power and flight or flight in these horror games. Because without it, you're removing the choice from the player and robbing the scene of any kind of impact or that build up and release. Now, speaking of which, another major problem with a lot of horror games and why it's hard to do it has to do with that very same concept, the build-up and release of tension. Anyone who's watched just about any horror movie in the last 30 years knows about how these movies are staged. You're never going to start a movie and immediately Jason walks onto the screen and stabs someone. No, there is a build-up. You know what's going to happen. You know someone's about to die, you just don't know when it's going to happen. And these movies love, and I mean love, to play with that expectation. Again, that build-up. But just as things have to get built up, they also have to be released. Eventually, Jason has to show up. Freddy has to start killing. The Thing starts doing his thing stuff, and so on. Without that, the movie just tends to dial itself back down, and the user or the viewer feels bored. And if the movie dials itself down like that, it's going to be very hard to build it up. There have been some very weird takes on Hellraiser and some of the later movies which I've had the, I guess, quote-unquote pleasure of watching. And these movies may be an hour and a half long, and Pinhead maybe is in there for 5 minutes out of the entire movie. And that is a very stark contrast to the earlier Hellraisers. Now, of course, there is something to be said about not overplaying your hand. Again, if it's a horror movie, we don't need to see Jason for an entire 60-minute stretch of 60 minutes in a row. But there has to be that balance between someone being scared and then letting that scare out. And one of the big ways that a lot of video games, not just in the indie space, but in AAA tend to mess up, is with fixed encounters. It goes back to that whole idea of the haunted house way of designing, wherein I'm going to walk around for an hour, and then at the exact moment that I step on into this room, a branch hits the window beside me. Or I walk up to this mirror, or this item, I pick it up, and an enemy just so happens to spawn behind me. It's very fixed. It's designed again around jump scares, but there has to be actual tension. If the player knows that only at this one specific point that they are in any sense of being in danger or they're going to get attacked, the rest of the game's going to feel like nothing. And I have those cases where I'm playing games like Amnesia or Outlast, where I'm just like, I don't care anymore. I'm just going to wander around, and if it happens, it happens, but I'm just so frustrated because nothing is going on. And that's another major point. When you're dealing with horror, the player should not be feeling frustrated by the design. And that really takes us to a very interesting discussion regarding control design and philosophy. For a lot of horror games, especially during the heyday of AAA horror, your Silent Hills, Fear Effect, Resident Evils, and the like, they dealt with fixed camera points and very tank-like controls. It wasn't me just, picking up this flashlight and going like this. It's I have to pick up the flashlight. I hit the, get into attack animation. And I go, like that. And that's going to be my major swing. And of course, the reason for that is very obvious. It's designed to elicit the feeling that the player is not playing a badass special forces, or a marine, or a secret agent. You are playing John or Jane Doe. But with that said, though, again, going back to this concept of ludonarrative dissonance, or even ludomechanical, if I'm trying to fight for my life, I'm not going to be swinging this flashlight like this. I'm going to be, batting it like a club for any semblance of trying to stay alive. And this is where a lot of these horror games tend to mess up on. Again, with giving the player options. Now, when it comes to those options, there has to be balance. It's not a horror game if I can just pick up a shotgun with infinite ammo and walk around blasting people with it. But at the same token, I need to have a way to escape. Let me, knock shelves over. Let me, throw a knife at someone. I mean, that is certainly an action, but that's not, a world-class knife thrower. That's just someone, going like this wildly for fear of their life. But again, if there's not any choice and there's only one way to go forward, then you might as well just be playing a haunted house simulator. Now, to wrap up today's critical thought, Horror design, again, is a mixture of philosophy, controls, and balance. And as we've seen, there is a very wide margin between action and horror. And you have to understand what you're going for with your game when you're building it. Kratos from God of War is never going to fit into a horror situation. I don't care what the developer or the director or the game designer is thinking. You can't put a character like Kratos and say, now feel scared. Just like how you can't take someone like the guy from Outlast or James Sunderland and put him in the shoes of Isaac Clarke and say, go around blasting people with your railgun / rocket launcher / assault rifle. And getting all these elements right requires a lot more thought and a lot more careful eye towards balance and design than I think a lot of people give credit for. One of these days, we need to take a look at Alien Isolation and discuss what it did so well in terms of balancing power and horror. But at the end of the day, getting horror right requires an understanding of what the player's role is, as well as the enemies. Because just as you can do not enough with enemies and fighting, you can do too much. As we've said before, one of the things that has really become that dividing line between action and horror, and the games that become action horror, is the number of situations that you're fighting in. In a game like Silent Hill or the original Resident Evil, combat is there, but it's not plentiful. There are plenty of rooms you're going to walk into and there aren't any enemies. In a game like Dead Space or I'm trying to think of some other, or even some of the later Resident Evil games like Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6, you'll only be walking to areas where all of a sudden the door closes behind you and then 15 guys come out of the woodwork to fight. And that's not a good example of design. You're supposed to make these situations small or sporadic, but impactful. And I've thought about that idea again of talking about the concept of an alpha antagonist. Something like the alien from Alien Isolation, where you can fight them, but it's not a matter of you winning. It's a matter of you trying to get away from them long enough to complete your task. And that's different from, say, a game like Haunting Ground or Clock Tower, where it's just all purely defense or purely stealth. So with that said, thanks for watching today's Critical Thought. Again, there's a lot to digest with horror, and maybe next year we won't wait until after Halloween to do it. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe, and let me know if you have any topics for future vlogs. But otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and check back for more discussions here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. If you'd like to suggest games for me to cover or topics to talk about, let me know in the comments below. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on design, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the Game Wisdom Patreon, you can find us on there on patreon.com/gwbycer. $1 will get you into our private Discord channel where we talk game topics and more. $5 will get you voting privileges for any major event, including the Saturday Night Grab Bag, Patreon-funded goals, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoy more videos here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel.